The Japanese are planning to send missiles to an island very close to Taiwan, and this is happening precisely at a moment when the Chinese threat in the region is no longer just a theory, but something very concrete, visible, and increasingly hard to ignore. It's not an exaggeration to say that today the world is looking at the Indo-Pacific with the same kind of concern and tension with which it once looked at Europe during the Cold War, when every strategic move carried global weight and potential consequences. And making it more and more clear that it is willing to change borders by force if it believes it can get away with it. In this scenario, seeing Japan, a historically cautious country, practically pacifist in its behavior since 1945, deeply marked by the trauma of war, moving with such seriousness and determination is a strong sign that the risk is not imaginary. Democracies in the region seem to have understood that if they don't prepare now, they may wake up too late, with little room left for reaction. The island at the center of this story is Yonaguni, small, remote, but extremely strategic from both a military and geographic point of view. It is the closest point of Japan to Taiwan, so close that on a clear day, it is almost possible to see the outline of the other side across the water, which reinforces the sense of proximity and vulnerability. It's no coincidence that there has been, for some years now, a self-defense forces based there, focused on surveillance and monitoring of the region, constantly tracking suspicious flights and vessels. What Tokyo is doing now is going beyond this role of merely watching what happens. To understand why this point has become such a priority, it's enough to recall 2022, when Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan deeply irritated and alarmed the Chinese regime. Beijing's response came in the form of large-scale military exercises around the island, warplanes flying information, naval vessels taking up positions in strategic areas, simulated blockades that look like a rehearsal for a real siege, and multiple missile launches. Some of those missiles landed uncomfortably close to Yonaguni, in areas near Japanese waters. All of a sudden, Japan realized it was no longer dealing with an abstract conflict between China and Taiwan, discussed only in diplomatic forums, but with real projectiles flying in the vicinity of its own territory and close to its citizens. For many analysts, that was the moment when the reality sank in. A crisis in Taiwan would inevitably drag Japan into the eye of the storm, whether it wanted that or not, simply because of geography and alliances. It is in this broader context that the current Prime Minister, Sanae Takaichi, has stated in the Japanese parliament that a Chinese attack on Taiwan could create a situation in which Japan would have to seriously activate its self-defense forces on a scale rarely considered since the post-war era. This statement is neither trivial nor just rhetorical. For decades, Japanese politicians avoided any phrase that might sound like a willingness to get involved in armed conflict, preferring very cautious and ambiguous language. When Tokyo starts publicly admitting that the Taiwan issue is also a matter of its own survival, it means the Chinese threat has crossed the line of what can be ignored in the name of prudence, forcing a rethinking of doctrine, planning, and readiness. Beijing's reaction to this Japanese move follows a familiar and predictable script. The Chinese government labeled the decision extremely dangerous, accused Japan of igniting military confrontation in the region, and tried to portray Tokyo as the side that is supposedly provoking and destabilizing the situation. It's interesting to compare this rhetoric with the actual behavior of the Chinese Communist Party. While it verbally attacks any defensive build-up by its neighbors, it rapidly increases its own military budget year after year, expands its navy with new ships and submarines, builds facilities and airstrips on disputed islands, and steps up pressure on Taiwan and the East China Sea on several fronts. When China arms itself, it calls it legitimate modernization and defensive needs. When a neighboring democracy takes limited steps to protect itself, it suddenly becomes a threat to peace and an escalation, a reversal that many observers see as purely political and self-serving. Japan responds to these criticisms with a simple and consistent message. What it is doing is defense, not aggression. Koizumi has rejected the idea that this posture raises tensions and argued that, on the contrary, military, it tends to prevent anyone from seeing Japan as an easy or undefended target, which would be extremely dangerous in any crisis scenario. This logic fits a security tradition that Western-aligned countries know well. Real and lasting peace is not based on naivety or wishful thinking, but on a balance of power and clear deterrence. When one side becomes much stronger, especially if that side is an authoritarian regime that doesn't answer to its citizens or to independent institutions, the temptation to push forward grows significantly. At the same time, Japan's plan for Yonaguni is not limited to the military or technical sphere. There is a clear and explicit concern for the civilians who live on these islands and would be on the front line of any crisis. The government's strategy for remote islands in an emergency is to try to evacuate people to Kyushu as quickly as possible, using ships and aircraft in a coordinated operation. But they know this may not be feasible in every scenario, especially if attacks come suddenly or if routes are blocked. That's why the project includes the construction of underground shelters, including a bunker beneath Yonaguni's town hall, designed to protect residents who cannot leave in time. This shows a genuine level of seriousness. It's not just about flexing military muscles outward, but about creating minimum protection conditions for those who live closest to the danger zone. This highlights a structural difference between democracies and dictatorships. In general, democracies spend time and resources thinking about how to preserve lives and act transparently, while authoritarian regimes almost always prioritize the survival and image of the ruling party over individual safety. From Taiwan's point of view, Tokyo's move is seen in a positive light, even if accompanied by natural diplomatic caution and carefully chosen wording. Taiwan's Deputy Foreign Minister, Wu Chi-chung, has avoided directly commenting on Japan's specific plan, but he emphasized something essential. Japan has the legitimate right to prioritize its own security, and Taiwan is focused on deepening ties with countries like Japan, the United States, and European nations, forming a broader web of support. This reveals a very clear sense of alignment. Taiwan sees itself as part of a community of democracies with shared values and interests, not as a satellite of an authoritarian power that demands submission. The stronger this cooperative network becomes, and the more coordinated these democracies are, the less likely China is to calculate that an attack or a blockade would be worth the risk, because the political, economic, and military costs would be much higher. It's important to remember who Taiwan is in this story, to understand why everything around it generates so much attention. It's not just any island on a map. We're talking about an extremely advanced market economy with a cutting-edge tech industry, especially semiconductors, that are essential to the global economy and are present in almost every modern electronic device. Politically, it's a vibrant democracy with real alternation of power between parties, a free and active press, and a high level of social and religious freedom that allows for genuine diversity of thought. In other words, Taiwan represents exactly what the Chinese Communist Party is not, a culturally Chinese society with the same civilizational roots, but politically free and pluralistic. That, in itself, is an enormous symbolic threat to a regime that presents itself as the only legitimate path for the Chinese people and fears any successful alternative model that could inspire comparisons. Within this broader framework, Japan's shift toward a firmer stance is not only a strategic or tactical choice. Washington, in turn, has every interest in seeing its Japanese ally more prepared, more capable, and more aware of its role in containing that threat, strengthening regional and global alliances in the process.